The stories contained in this podcast are the recollections of the guests we've invited onto the show. We are an outlet for people to share their truths, and we accept no legal responsibilities for the stories contained herein.
I'm Kendra Sheets.
And I'm Rich Gill.
And this is Enough, a podcast that aims to shine light into the darkened corners of the music industry while discussing the ways we can and should improve ourselves and, in turn, our community.
Welcome back to another episode of the Enough podcast. My name is Kendra Sheets, and I am one of your co-hosts.
I'm your other co-host, Rich Gill.
And today we are so very excited and lucky enough to have a wonderful guest, Sascha. Would you like to give yourself a little bit of an introduction and explain your history with music, what you're doing currently, and just let everyone know a bit about you?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm super honored to be on the podcast with you all. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to tell some stories. Yeah, my name's Sascha Altman DuBrul, and I grew up in New York City. I'm 50 years old, and I'm a therapist. I work primarily with people who have been diagnosed with psychotic disorders, so like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, like that kind of thing. The reason I do that is because I myself am diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and I spent a bunch of time locked up in psychiatric hospitals starting from when I was a teenager. I feel like the useful thing to say about me and my relationship to music is that I came of age in the late 1980s and early 1990s in New York City. And I was like, you know what? I listened to Christy Rhodes' podcast, the interview you did with Christy, and it was inspiring to me. So I'm going to follow her lead, okay? Because she and I are roughly contemporaries. I was raised like a middle-class kid in Manhattan, but my parents were working-class children of immigrants. So my mom grew up in the Bronx, and her whole family were Greek Jews, and my dad was Irish Catholic, and they met in the late 60s. And I am the product of these two people who were very, different culturally. I wasn't raised with a lot of roots. I was basically raised like a white kid in Manhattan. And when I found the punk scene, my dad died when I was 13, and I was a really angry kid. These two girls from my high school brought me down to this anarchist meeting in this basement next to this place called Tompkins Square Park, which at the time in New York City was the only park in the city that didn't have a curfew. And there was all kinds of people living there. And that neighborhood, if you can imagine it, the city's really different now, but back then in the late 1980s, on every block, there were basically apartment buildings that had been abandoned and torched by their landlords to collect insurance money, and then people were living in those buildings. And so I went from being kind of like a sheltered kid on the Upper West Side to hanging out with the punks on the Lower East Side. There was kids from all over the country that had run away from home and were living in those buildings, and there was a very interesting kind of wild scene down there where there was just a lot of folks who just didn't fit into society. And back in those days, if you think about it, it's kind of hard to imagine now, but if you were living in a squatted building, that meant you weren't paying rent. And if you weren't paying rent, that meant you didn't have to work. Maybe you had a little hustle here or there, but it wasn't like the world is today where everyone's scrambling. And so my relationship to punk rock was very wrapped up in this counterculture. I don't want to romanticize it and say that it was all just easy or whatever. There was a lot of drugs and there was a lot of dysfunctional behavior, but also there was a lot of freedom. So me and my friends were playing in bands. There were different squatted cultural centers. There was a place called ABC near Rio that was a place where people were every Saturday there'd be shows. That's kind of the scene that I came of age in.
I spent a little bit of time in New York when I graduated high school in the late 90s. I was I'm going to run away to New York and make it in New York. And I spent a lot of time in St. Mark's Place and going to shows at Coney Island High. And years later, going back, it was just so weird to be oh, now it's Starbucks and a Gap store and stuff like that. And it was just really weird to see this isn't the place I remember it being.
It's been a long time since those times when you were living in New York. I'm sure you've reflected on it just like me, but there's something interesting about identity and the identity of punk rock. I don't know about you and the scene that you were hanging out in, but for me, the identity was very wrapped up in this idea of being an outcast or being like not fitting into society. Like I don't fit into society, so I find some other people and we're rebels somehow. Somewhere in the mid 1990s, I was playing in a band called Choking Victim, which was like, we were just like a local squatter band. But I remember like that was the point in time in which Green Day suddenly got on the cover of Rolling Stone and Nirvana, signed to a major record label. And then suddenly the culture that my friends and I had like coveted as like our like radical culture was everywhere, like Rancid videos on MTV, whatever, like that whole thing. And we were pissed about it. We were like really, we were like, fuck these people. We're the real punks or whatever.
Right.
But in retrospect, when I think about it now as a grown-ass man, I'm like, well, so much of the culture that I thought of as my own really has its origins in rock and roll, which was like black people making music. It was a black culture, and punk rock there's like the race dynamics of punk are very interesting because it's very white, but at least in the scene that I was a part of, we were very much explicitly, in a way a lot of other places weren't back in the day, saying like, we won't have sexist or racist or homophobic bands that, are part of here. And that was a big part of the culture, So I can speak about like the punk rock that I came from, but I'm pretty sure those are threads that like come through. I even think about like the podcast you guys are doing and like how you decided to do it. I don't know how you decided to do it, but this like, we're going to talk about power dynamics, or we're going to talk about like gender in the, in the music scenes. It's a very punk rock thing to do, to open up that space that you don't see in a lot of other spaces.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons why Kendra and I started doing this was the punk that we came up with that was like exciting to us was explicitly like anti-racist, anti-sexist, and you can talk about what's real and what's not when it comes to punk, but there were all these like kind of subgenres that were like kind of seemed like the opposite of that. Maybe not overtly, but we were seeing all these things where it's like, okay, like, women and trans people and people of color don't always feel safe in these spaces. And let's talk about that and just be open about it, not just, people can kind of hide behind, oh, it's punk. It's like, we're better than that. And it's like, well, yes, we should be, but that's not always the case.
Right. And talking about is the first step to, eliciting any sort of change.
I'll tell you all a story. So when I was 17, so I left New York and I went off to go to college. I didn't last for very long, but I went for a year to college in Portland, Oregon. And I remember being 17 years old at this place called the X-Ray Cafe. And this new band, Bikini Kill, was playing. And they like showed up and we were all there. And the singer, Kathleen Hanna, got up on the stage and she was like, all the boys to the back of the room, all the girls to the front. Girls are dancing in the front. And I remember being like, what? Because as much as the scene that I grew up in, we tried to be anti-sexist or whatever, there was this whole kind of old school thing. You would see like at a show, the boyfriend would be like, here, hold my jacket, baby, so I can dance in the pit, and like and that whole thing. So I feel like I was like a teenager that witnessed the rise of the Riot Girl movement, and all that stuff had a big effect on me and like how I was thinking about myself. And also, frankly, part of the reason I mentioned my parents at the beginning of this is that, I mean, as a therapist, I'm like always thinking about people's parents, like like we could try to get away from where we come from, but like, we are the products of the people that raise us. And my mom was a tried and true second wave feminist who was part of the whole wave of women who left their husbands in the late 1970s, like that was I was a product. My mom left my dad when I was 3 and she was like, fuck this, and I'm not going to like pick up after this guy and just take care of him. And I think in some ways, once again, I don't know about you all and your life experience, but what I see, like I grew up in a particular kind of way, but I also, I know a lot of people from different cultural, political, economic milieus. And the second wave of feminism like didn't fucking happen in a lot of places. Like that kind of attempt to create some kind of equality. No, for a lot of people, that was not what was going on in people's homes or whatever. So I think about that a lot, and I try to give people the benefit of the doubt, man. Think about the kids that are getting raised right now with this like overt fascism. I just say this as, like I'm excited to have a conversation with you where we talk about accountability and how we create accountability in communities. But I think you got to start that conversation with a real like humility of like understanding that people come from really different places.
I'd love to hear a little bit about how you ended up as a therapist from squatting in a park or going to see Kathleen Hanna and Bikini Kill in Portland. How did you go from 17 in Portland all the way to current day being a therapist, understanding the different backgrounds of everyone and kind of bringing all of your ideas of different musical cultures, I guess, all together?
So basically, how I like mentioned how I got locked up in psych hospitals when I was young? Okay, well, I got locked up in psych hospitals like a number of times. For me, it was a very formative experience, like being an 18-year-old, spending months in a psych unit and told I had a serious mental illness. And part of what it did for me was it made me, when I got out of being locked up, I was like, I don't want to have anything to fucking do with this. I don't want to ever have anyone tell me, that I could like put me in a locked ward and tell me I can't leave or whatever. So like a bunch of my 20s, I was kind of a wild person because on some level, because I'd watched my dad die when I was young, and like, I just didn't believe I was going to live. And so I just had this life for a bunch of years. So I was like riding freight trains across the country, and I was doing political solidarity work with like the Zapatistas down in Mexico. And then I was like working on Earth First road blockades up in the Pacific Northwest. And I was like engaged in all these different kinds of politics. And unfortunately, what ended up happening like a number of times is like in the midst of all that, I would find myself locked up in a psych ward, And so it was this thing where it was like, am I living wild? Am I free? Or am I a crazy person? The thing that was different about my story than a lot of people is that because I grew up in the punk rock scene and like really embraced it, I was someone who just never felt like I fit in anywhere else. I had a really hard time in school. Now they call it ADHD, but they didn't even like use that language back then. I just was like, I had learning disabilities or whatever. So I was just like a really frustrated kid. And so punk rock really helped me. And therefore, when they told me that I had a serious mental illness, when they told me that I was bipolar or whatever, I was like, that suicidal tendencies song that's like, I'm not crazy, you're the one that's crazy. Like, I went to your schools, I went to your, like all that whole thing. I just fucking embraced that shit. And when I was 27 years old, I wrote an article because I was like writing all during this time, like in my 20s and stuff. I would like write stories and write zines. This is like pre-internet times. I wrote the story that was like published in a mainstream newspaper in San Francisco about my experiences being diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And like thousands of people read it, the story, and it like changed my life because I went from all of a sudden having this thing I was ashamed of and I didn't know how to talk about to suddenly there were all these people who wanted to talk to me about it. I met my best friend, who's still my best friend all these years later, Jax McNamara, and we started a website called the Icarus Project. And basically what we said was people like us, diagnosed bipolar, rather than seeing ourselves as diseased or disordered, we see ourselves as having dangerous gifts. So that was like the vision of the Icarus Project. And it was a very punk rock project. Like simultaneously, I wanted to reach all like the punk rock kids and like the activists. I don't know if you are aware of this, but like many people who do like frontline activism, or like those kids that I was talking about earlier who were squatting, or like people putting themselves on, trying to like putting themselves in the line of fire, often are like really intense people who have unresolved trauma and are like acting it out in their lives. So I want to reach people like that. But then I also wanted to reach people who were like, weren't from a world like that and could benefit from the kind of things that like a punk rock community could. So yeah, like the kind of like anarchist traveler punk rock world that I came from. At this point, all these years later, it's silly that I was even thinking like this, but I wanted to create a mental health support group that was like Food Not Bombs, that like people could just start up in their local towns. We figured out eventually that it wasn't quite so easy. That, but to answer your question, which was how did I go from the punk rock music world that I come from, and how am I a therapist now? My gateway was the 12 years that I ran the Icarus Project, and then at some point I was like, I want to go to school and I want to get a counseling degree. Because the thing with Icarus was that it was like a peer-based mental health support group. So the boundaries were kind of fuzzy. Maybe if I get a counseling degree, that'll fucking help me have better boundaries. Maybe I'll have mentors. That was a huge part of why I went to social work school that I didn't actually get from social work. I was looking for mentorship, and I learned quickly that in the world of social work, you ain't going to find it. Unless you're really lucky, just like getting a clinical supervisor, you're probably not going to find the kind of mentorship that I was looking for.
As people who identify as punk or whatever, a lot of the thinking is that all of this exists outside of society, fuck society, that whole side of punk. But at the same time, there are ways to work within the systems to sort of provide that punk rock DIY ethos, but do it in a way that is a little more, I don't want to say mainstream, but within the systems that exist to sort of like reach more people.
One of the things coming from like the radical underground of punk rock for me that was really important, just as like a strategy, was understanding that the underground is really, really useful for some things. There's all these things that can happen in like the cultural underground. You can experiment with new ways of thinking and doing, and you can like support each other in ways that like having like a container like that. But if you're trying to actually change things, you need to be able to engage with the mainstream, and understand that if you're working in the mainstream, by definition, things are going to get watered down. They're not going to be as radical. They're not going to be as cool. But understanding that relationship between the underground and the mainstream, I think, is really important. Years ago, what we did in Icarus, I had this metaphor that I would talk about. I talk about dandelions, about the plant, the plant. I don't know if y'all ever like, go in gardens or whatever, but dandelions are different than a lot of plants because they have deep tap roots that go into the subsoil and then pull up nutrients from the subsoil. For example, Kendra, were you saying that you're in social work school?
I just graduated.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah. I don't know what your experience was like in social work school, but I found myself that there were some really positive aspects to it, but also there were some really backwards things to it as well. I mean, there were just like things that we were studying that within my community of like radical mental health activists, we understood it way better. Like, I remember going into my clinical 3 class one night and, and the professor was like, okay, tonight we're going to talk about borderline personality disorder, and it's like, he's writing on the board, he's using the DSM, he's talking about, but I just sat there and I got on social media and I was like, hey, they're talking about borderline personality disorder in my clinical 3 class. What do you all think? And within a couple minutes, because of my social media following, I had people from all over the world who like were diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and had like all kinds of like creative radical takes on it. And that for me was an example of like, okay, I'm tapped into like a radical community, so I have access to that, but most people don't. One thing that Icarus taught me was the power of groups of people online to be able to create new ways of thinking about things and share them. I don't know, what was your social work program experience like?
So I did it all online, so it was a little bit different. I didn't go in class in person like that, but we did instead of doing like a group discussion, we'd have like a discussion board where we would have to post an initial post and then all of us would have to respond to everyone's post to keep a dialogue going, which I thought was interesting. But I felt like kind of what you had mentioned when we got to talking about, like, I had a whole class about the DSM-5, and the way that it was approached by the professor, I appreciated, because they basically said at the beginning, we're going to teach this. This is going to seem really cut and dry. You're never going to come across someone who's going to basically be this exact definition of whatever the thing may be. So understand that as you move into your practice, you're not going to look at depression and be like, yes, 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 all the way across the board. And what I think I learned from it was that my personal experiences with the things that I've struggled with people in my life who I know have different diagnosable conditions, quote unquote. Everyone contains multitudes, and I feel like it's very tricky when you're dealing with people to basically try to slap a label on someone and hope that they fit within that mold in any way. You can kind of maybe, get like 3 inches here and 2 inches there, and you kind of got half of them, but not all of them, just because there's no one person that's really going to fit the entire mold every single time. But I felt like I was lucky because most of my classes, I felt like I had professors who understood that whatever they were teaching, there was some flexibility behind it, and it wasn't always just cut and dry.
Yeah, that sounds good. So the thing for me, if you were gonna go back to this question you asked about, like, okay, well, how does like the world of punk rock like inform yourself as a therapist? For me, it's like all these years later, I don't have like a music community that I'm particularly a part of, where I'm like, oh, these are my people. But I have a community of like radical mental health activists, and it's like a very punk rock kind of thing, because they're people that I can call upon when I need to. And, part of being a therapist is having supervision. It's like you're working with people, and then it's like it's really important to have outside perspective. I mean, supervision is like, it's like having therapy, it's just
Yeah.
important to have like other people, you can reflect with. I have that in all these different ways. Like if I'm having trouble making sense of some situation that I'm working with a person, there's like any number of people that I can call and reach out to. It's like your DSM class. Some diagnoses are more intense than others.
Mm-hmm.
Like in recent years, there's been a lot of, I've watched, having been around for like 25 years in the mental health arena, I've seen a lot of language about like anti-stigma campaigns. Oh, we need to reduce the stigma of mental illness or whatever. And like, I don't know if you realize this, but those campaigns are almost entirely funded by pharmaceutical companies. It's like drug companies that have a vested interest in you not feeling stigmatized about your mental health, so you'll take drugs. And just to be clear, I take drugs. I'm pro psych drug if it makes sense. There's certain diagnoses like psychosis and bipolar disorder, which they come with a lot of weight. They come with a lot of like, fear people have, like almost, does it mean violence? Are we talking about violence? No class on the DSM is going to get you around that. I mean, what we did in the Icarus Project is we'd basically say, you may have this label of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, and maybe you need that diagnosis so you can get the services that you need, so you can get your disability checks or whatever it is that you need. But don't let it get into your soul and make you think that it's actually like this is who you are, because it's not. It ain't like that, I had the coolest internship my first year in social work school. I was working at a place called the Parachute Program, where I would go with a team and we would go to people's homes where someone in the family had gotten out of the hospital and been diagnosed with a psychotic disorder. And we would sit with the families and talk to them. And it was this incredible learning experience for me, because I realized even me, who had these radical ideas, I had been thinking about mental illness as something that was like, okay, one person has the mental illness, and then everybody else is like reacting to that mental illness. If you look at the history of systemic family therapy, like in the 1960s and 70s, they were doing all this work where they were showing how maybe one person was the identified patient in a family, but the whole family was experiencing all kinds of issues. And in a lot of ways, our current medical model, our current model that like where we learn the DSM and we're like, okay, this is what the, the illness is, it gets us away from thinking about like actually how we're all connected to each other. And I think that way of thinking, you can extend it to even thinking about like communities and how some people are just like really intense, like have a really hard time, but then can end up being like the focal point where a whole group of people can be like, that person's really fucked up right there, like they're an abuser or they're or whatever. And then it becomes this like way for a group of people to not have to look at their own relationship to the same issues. And oftentimes you see it's like the people who are the accusers who are like, saying someone is so bad, they actually have their own issues that are going on, but they're like not. Yeah. I'm actually curious, how has it been for you guys? Because you've been doing this podcast for a long time. So I imagine you've come across that dynamic sometimes.
Well, I think for us personally, early on, after Ritual, was it like less than a year's worth of episodes or so, we basically had our own episode where we talked about our realizations of behaviors that we had engaged, not sexual abuse, but just where we didn't treat people the right way that people should be treated. Or when someone said something, we're like, oh, I don't know if I believe them, because of my ties to another person. So we spent some time early on reflecting on our own behaviors, because you kind of can't not when you spend so much of your time around this. It's really hard to listen to so many stories and talk to so many survivors and then deal with the onslaught of the repercussions of talking and publicizing stories of survivors and getting messages from other people who have similar stories, but we can't share those. So especially in the first few years, like an entire second life. So we spent a lot of time personally, and, talking to each other and reflecting on our own actions of kind of the life that we lived before the podcast. And not that anything was out of the ordinary terrible, but just stuff where we really felt like we didn't align with the people that we are now and, what we would do differently. I've reached out to some people one-on-one that I felt like I didn't really, engage with properly when things came up back, 10 plus years ago.
One of the things that you wrote was the centered accountability, which I think we'd both love to sort of talk about a little bit.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's talk about centered accountability. So I ended up doing this training. This is before I went to social work school, but I knew that I wanted to work like in the realm of working with people one-on-one. And I studied with this woman named Stacey Haynes, who founded an organization called Generative Somatics. This is all in the Bay Area. This is a very Bay Area thing I'm about to tell you about. Stacey Haynes was also the founder of an organization called Generation 5, and the mission statement of Gen 5 was to eradicate childhood sexual abuse in 5 generations. That was their mission. And she was she's a badass. And she partnered with this guy, I can't remember his name, but he was someone who had studied Aikido and was a coach. And she basically developed a program for social justice activists to learn how to use their bodies in a way, learn how to get centered in their bodies to be able to be more effective organizers. So I was part of this program for 8 months. That's how I got introduced to this idea of centered accountability. But the basic idea in that model, what it means to center in their kind of coaching model is that we all have conditioned tendencies, okay? So there's ways that when we get, they use the language of grabbed, when you're grabbed by the world, which can be a physical grab. It can be someone coming and grabbing your arm or something. But it could also just be you turn on your phone and you're looking at social media and I don't know, you see something about what's going on in Gaza or something, you're grabbed, There's only a few responses you can really have to a grab. One of them is fight, flight, and one of them is freeze, and one of them is appease. That's the basic responses to getting grabbed. And what we learned to do in generative somatics was to basically, we learned the centering practice. It was a very somatic physical centering practice. And we would make commitments. We would say, this is what's important to me, and I'm centering on it. And then we'd practice getting grabbed. So we'd partner up. It's a picture of a bunch of people in a room partnering up, and then someone grabs you by the arm, and you slow down and notice what it means, what it feels like. In my case, I'm someone who I have like a freeze tendency. That's something that happens to me. Like if I get grabbed, I'll just freeze and kind of shut down. And in the process of like noticing what comes up, you can center and whatever. Anyway, the idea with centered accountability is basically like when you're trying to be accountable to another person or to a group of people, there's like a couple different directions it could go, you know? You could be centered and just be able to say really clear, like, hey, you were using an example before about committing some kind of harm against someone, like, hey, I'm really sorry I did that, and I'm open to repair. Or you could be over accountable, and over accountability looks like, oh, I'm really sorry I did that. I know I'm a really bad person, and I really don't, I really want to try, so that's over accountability. And then under accountability can be like, what, like, why are you even talking to me about this? Like, I didn't do anything, like for some of us, it comes easier than others to be accountable. And I'll tell you a story from my life, which is basically, I'm very proud of the Icarus Project and all the things that we did, but I was also like in my 20s, like when I was in that organization, and I was also like I'm kind of an intense guy that like, I used to have a lot more boundary issues than I do now. Like literally just like not even respecting people's boundaries, being like, come on, let's just stay up all night and work on this thing or whatever, And, I pushed a lot of people's boundaries in the Icarus Project, and there were people that were pissed at me. I also like, because of whatever my male socialization, it's some combination of like male socialization and ADHD. Like there was a bunch of like tasks that I always just would put on other people that always happened to be people who were socialized as women. And then, there were a couple times there were women that I had sexual relationships with that were wasn't necessarily so appropriate. What was I saying earlier about like how I went to social work school, so I wanted to learn to have better boundaries? Well, my boundaries weren't so great. And there came a time where there was a group of people that got together to talk about like the dysfunctional issues in the Icarus Project. And they they singled out my behavior, and they said that like, I had fucked up in all these different ways. Now, here's the thing. It's the year 2025. I'm talking about stuff that happened a really long time ago. I wish so badly that I could go back in time now and be able to have like a grown ass man conversation with like, the younger version of me that was like getting called out by a group of people. But there was no older man to have that conversation with me. And I felt like so incredibly horrible about myself, about my behavior, and fell under the category of a lot of like over accountability. And I felt all the shame. Now, all these years later, there may be still a person or two that's like pissed off at me about like Icarus Project stuff. But by this point, I feel like that stuff is all like water under the bridge. But it took a lot of years for me to really own my behavior back in those days. And I ended up causing a lot of harm in the community just by not being able to step up and be accountable. So the thing that I would say, like, I don't know who's listening to this out there who's like interested in like small radical organizations and how they handle their business of being accountable. But I would say that for people who are being called out, having older mentor types who can like help them understand more about shame and help them understand more about like the different parts of themselves that might be hiding, I think would be really important. Another thing that occurs to me listening to you all talk and like imagining your journey in this, doing this work, is that there's something really different about being accountable when it's just like you and, the couple people around you, and your family or something like that, as opposed to being in, I don't know, a music scene or in some, like, where your behavior is, being watched. And basically, like, if you're, depending on how you respond, it's actually going to have a big impact on whether you're going to be able to, like, do things in the world or be ostracized. My biggest fear in those days when I was, like, fucking up with the Icarus Project was the fear that I would be ostracized and cast aside. And what I came to, like, I don't know, came to understand in therapy at some point, just doing this inner work was, wow, there's parts of me that are so scared that go all the way back to being a little kid in the playground, the fear that I won't be accepted by the people around me. And all these things aren't necessarily like if you've committed harm, and you need to, like, be accountable, like, all this stuff I'm saying is not what you would want to be saying to someone, but it's stuff you want to be, like, working out on your own. And what I've seen, and I think the piece of writing that I shared with you talks about, is that in recent years in my life, I've had a number of therapy clients who are, like, way younger than me and come from the punk rock scene and have had these, like, horrible accountability processes where, like, maybe someone thought that it was a good idea, but there was no fucking grown-ups around to, like, actually hold space. And I think that that's a theme. I think that's the thing that, like, as much as I love the punk rock world that I come from, there were suspiciously few elders around. It was a youth culture. And, like, what do you do when there's no elders to be able to, like, be good examples and hold the space? Or, like, in my case, I feel like there was older dudes in the punk scene I grew up in, but they were, like, hitting on my teenage
Yes.
friends,
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was going to
Yeah.
say, they're elders, even now, they're elders, but they still have the mentality of, like, an 18 to 24-year-old, where they have not gone through the practices of, taking accountability for their own actions and growing in that way, and basically being able to fulfill and heal themselves so they can turn around and then help others through the same process. They're still, like, stunted youths.
Yeah, well, it's kind of been my, like I said at the beginning of our conversation, I'm 50 years old, like, I've been around for a little while. And when I started my private practice, it was really coming from this place that was like, okay, it's not like I have it all figured out, but I have enough figured out, and I really want to be there for people who are younger. And then it turns out it's actually, like, great. It's like it's like, this is how we grow. We grow from having to step into eldership. I wish that there were more ways in our culture to do it.
One thing I think we've noticed with a lot of the, as we call it, like, the cookie cutter apology stuff for people who get called out for things, is it's full of, like, buzzwords and all these things that they say, but they're not, like you said, like, doing therapy on themselves and, like, figuring out what maybe the root of the issue is or where all of this comes from, and just being like, either, like, deny, or, like, I was drunk, I was high, that's why this happened. The punk scene is pretty small when it comes down to it. Like, everybody kind of knows everybody in some sort of way, even if they haven't, like, actually met. So if someone says that they're doing something like going to therapy, going to rehab to work on themselves and stuff like that, if they're being called out for something, like, you'll hear if they're not, because, you probably know someone who's close to them and will be like, oh yeah, he said all this, but, hasn't really done anything. Or, yeah, he has been going to intense therapy and been sober for X amount of time. So yeah, you can, like, the people who are doing the work and the people who are just like, oh, I'm just going to say this and then I can take a 6-month vacation from making music and then come back later and it'll be fine.
Yeah, I mean, I think, once again, there's a really big difference between being accountable to your people in your daily life or whatever. You're in a small community, you have a family. I think about how am I accountable to my partner? I, like, work really hard to be accountable to her in lots of ways. But I'm trying to imagine what it would be like if it was like, oh, I have to be accountable to her and I have to like post about it on social media and like make a statement.
That's, yeah. Snippet of an interview with Aziz Ansari, who was talking about when he was sort of, a woman wrote this article about him about this bad date that they had been on.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
there was this whole thing about it. And recently it talked about people kind of like saying, well, why didn't you say anything publicly about this? And he was like, I reached out to her personally and we did this all like between the two of us. It didn't need to be a public thing because it was between two people. And I reached out to her and apologized and whatnot. So, yeah, I mean, not everything has to be out on social media.
Well, do you think that there's a kind of additional requirement when you're a public figure? Not saying that people in the punk scene really need to like hop on Facebook, that they're that public of figures that they need to be like, here's what I've done. But like Aziz Ansari is like fairly well known. And if the case, the whole situation's been publicized and it's on social media, I guess some sort of like gossipy news or something like that, and you don't hear anything else after that, in my head, I would think if I'm a public figure, I would basically do something on the side, one-on-one quietly, 100%. But then like, how do you salvage your career? Because the last thing the public has heard about you is that you're this terrible person who had this terrible date, who said these terrible things, period. And they don't know that you've gone through therapy and you've talked to this person and everything is on the up and up now or whatever. You almost are like, I feel like when you need to find a way to salvage your career. But I also feel like that's a slippery slope because then you're forced into a public situation again. It's just a big catch-22.
Yeah, is there a correct answer on either side?
I don't think so. I was just posing a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. But I will say, in some ways, when I reflect going back all the way to like the punk scene of my youth and the things we had going for it, the fact that we were challenging each other, the fact that we did call each other out, the fact that was really wonderful. And actually, when I think about it, actually, at the same time that the punk scene that I was a part of was going on, just a couple blocks away at CBGB's, that was like the heyday of like the New York hardcore scene, which was like way violent and way super macho and just like a whole other thing. Like we like existed in these realities that were separate from each other. But in these times where fascism is literally, it's rising in this country, we're just seeing all the ways that leftist movements are, like the vice president goes on, yesterday and starts talking about like targeting, NGOs that are leftist, whatever, like it's worth reflecting on. I'll say this as someone who, I come from a radical political family. Like my grandparents were communists that were blacklisted during the McCarthy era. And so that's part of my understanding of things. And all those blacklists and all that stuff that was going on did terrible things to movements. And so I've just been thinking about, I knew I was going to be talking to you guys and just knew we were going to be having this conversation about like, what does it mean to be accountable on movements? And I think we just need to have movements where people really take care of each other and don't fucking tear each other to pieces. And I will add something that I haven't said yet that I just feel like is a big part of my work and what I do. I mentioned earlier that I have this interest in systemic family therapy, and I'm like a certified internal family systems therapist. But internal family systems is a really useful model for working with people and doing work on ourselves, because it starts from this basic idea that everybody has multiple parts and that there's no bad parts. There's like, you may have some parts that do bad things, but they're not fundamentally bad parts. And the other piece about IFS that's really important is that everybody has a self that is fundamentally curious and compassionate and creative and courageous and calm, and that's the part that you want to be running the show. Like that, like your self is what you want to be. You want to be self-led. And I say this all because I think about the kind of polarizations that happen in communities where people are like demonized when they do shitty things to other people. Now, it's harder on like a community level to have a conversation like this, but as a therapist, I get the benefit of being able to talk to people who've done terrible things, really hurt people and done bad things. But the place that I'm coming from is like, this person is not bad. This person is not bad. And the only way to actually do this kind of work well is if you really understand that you're not bad. And that takes work. And like, so the stuff I was talking about before about centered accountability, in an earlier version of my life, I felt like I was a terrible person. I'd be like going along doing my thing and then get crippled with shame because I felt like, oh my God, I've done such terrible things. And when it came down to it, when I finally ended up doing that therapy that helped me get through to the other side, I realized that it wasn't any harm that I perpetrated on anyone that was like making me feel so bad. It was really like stuff that happened when I was like 3 years old. Like it was really like my parents getting divorced and my mom having all this anger towards my dad and like me having this like kind of compulsive thing of like seeking out people who kind of reminded me of my angry mom in my life, and then learning to have compassion for that. And then all of a sudden life got a lot simpler because I just wasn't so wrapped up in this old fucking family drama that kept me in loops for years.
I think a lot of people feel that way. Sascha, as you
Yeah.
mentioned, like, with your own personal experience, a lot of the things that you were dealing with in, later in your life in your 20s plus stemmed from early, early years. And that happens to a lot of people. I mean, I've, like Rich, like you, I felt the same way, thinking that I didn't know how to like properly act and I was just causing harm to people all the time. And it wasn't always, harm in regards to like any sort of abuse or assault. It was just like being a fuck up. Every conversation I had, I would end up,
Yeah.
I felt like I was insulting people. I'd go up to people and I would like, I know for a period of time, and this is way too much information, this is just like a side note, but back when Facebook was actually usable and not just the cesspool that it is now of a whole bunch of ants screaming in caps locks, I used to keep tabs on like all of the people that I was like friends with or acquaintance with in like the Chicago punk scene. And I would know who they were dating and what they were doing. And they went all these places. And I would go to like a show and I would see them and I'd be like, hey, how's your girlfriend? Blah, blah, blah. And the next thing I know, they'd be like, we broke up. And I would kick myself all night long being like, I screwed up that whole conversation. They hate me. There's no way. I'm such a bad person. I would like give myself this negative self-talk just because I didn't keep up with the fact that someone had broken up with someone else, or I was drunk and I said the wrong thing. Like, it was just this consistent kind of circular narrative that I had. And it all stemmed from stuff that happened very early on in my childhood that ended having me basically feel like the conversations that I was having, the ways that I was presenting myself to the world wasn't good enough. And Sascha, like you mentioned, I had the same kind of thing where I really, really wanted because I didn't fit in with so many people so young and early on, I felt like I wanted everyone later in my like chosen group to accept me. And when I didn't feel like they were 100% accepting of me, it's because I did something wrong. I'm a bad person. I'm not like engaging enough or nice enough or this or that or whatever. And so I just kind of went through this entire process. And in the end, I just kind of realized I'm going to be accountable for the things I'm going to do. I need to work on bettering myself in certain ways, but also there's a bunch of people that like I spend a lot of time bending over backwards for, and they fucking suck. So I don't really need to be nice to them anyway. So I'm just going to find my people, and all those other people can just leave me alone. And that to me was very freeing, but also a huge part of that was realizing that I needed to take accountability for the way I was acting, because the way that I was kind of entering the world in social situations stemmed from a like crazed anxiety. So I was talking to people on a level where they were already just like, I can't, because I wanted so much for things to be in a certain way. And then I would end up doing or saying something I shouldn't have said. So, not that it was, again, make or break, but I needed to be more accountable for my own situation. So I wasn't just entering the world and being like, hi, oh my God, let's be best friends. I know all these things about you from Facebook, which sounds like a crazy person thing to say.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the therapist in me would be like that part of you that's like wanting, like wanting that connection and like kind of pushing over the boundaries of someone. Like, what kind of relationship do you have with that part of you? Is that part still around? Like what? That's the thing is, once you come from, this is my plug for internal family systems. Once you come from a self-led place, you're like any part of yourself that is having some issues or, has gotten you into trouble or whatever, you can approach that part from a place of, because if you don't, any version of like, okay, I'm going to push that part away. I'm going to put that part in a box somewhere. I'm going to like make sure that no one ever sees that part. It's going to come back around in some other twisted way. Like, I think it's really important to get to know ourselves. Well, cool. I appreciate you all being real. I'm glad I could share with you, and you shared back. It's good.
I think a lot of us feel like it's very easy to just become disenchanted with how everything is going because every day it seems like there's something else that's just like, oh fuck, now this is happening and now like these people's rights were trampled on again. I've really had to give social media a little bit of a rest because I can last about 2 minutes and then I want to fucking throw my phone across the room. But with all that being said, what are some things that you see in the world or in your work or in other people's work that sort of give you hope to keep doing what we're all doing and kind of keep moving forward in the sort of climate that we're in?
I think that it's really important for us to see ourselves as actors in history. I mean, I think that it can be so easy to get overwhelmed with the state of the world. There's just like so many levels right now where bad shit is going down. But I think keeping with the theme of our conversation, I think there's a real power in small groups of people to make changes, you know? I think about the underground and what is possible when you're not having to like be out there in the mainstream. Like I saw years ago, I saw this poster that said, "Don't drink from the waters of the mainstream." And I was like, yeah, that's it. I think it's important for us to do things on small levels with our friends. Many years ago, I read this book that had a big effect on me. It was called Lipstick Traces: A Secret History of the 20th Century. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it was written by this guy, Grail Marcus, and it was about how punk rock has its origins. Like it grew out of these other social movements from earlier in the 20th century, Dada and the Surrealists, that were like movements that like were also came out of times like we're living in now, where there was just a lot of war. And the Dada and the Surrealists then inspired a group called the Situationists in Paris in the late 1960s, which then ended up inspiring Malcolm McLaren, who was the manager of the Sex Pistols, and he like used a bunch of Situationist slogans and Sex Pistols songs. And something he said in that book has always lasted with me, which is that all of those movements that I just described were actually very small. They were very small groups of people, but they inspired each other. And look, the future is unwritten. I'm like a big Clash fan. I'm like really into Joe Strummer, you know. He's like a
Have a
dad figure for me.
flash tattoo. So yeah, I'm with you.
Wait, let me see. Let me see.
The Straight to Hell single cover.
Yeah, that guy just like, yeah, he speaks to me, you know? Like, life is for living. Do your fucking best to like actually live and to actually like, enjoy yourself to the greatest extent possible. And then for me, it's about like having a good life. Part of having a good life is feeling connected to something much larger than me. And so I have social movements that I'm a part of that I feel like this is like, I'm here doing what I can. I'm tiny. I'm fucking tiny. But I'm like connected to something bigger than me. And I have seen the power of a small amount of words in the right space having an effect on another person. So that's how I keep going. I can't tell you like where to put one's energy right now, but I would just say like whoever you're putting your energy with, like that's what's actually really important. And to the conversation, what Kendra was saying before about struggling with being social, like being social is like living in a hall of mirrors, We always are reflecting stuff back. If I think someone is mad at me, inevitably it's because there's part of me that's like mad at me. And like if you get clear with yourself, things become more clear. And we were talking about like, okay, how important it is to like be in therapy. Yes, I think therapy is, incredibly useful. But I think just the process of like self-realization, like how do we get to know ourselves, like being a person who can like reflect on the parts of ourselves that are like one thing that has become really clear to me over the course of my life is that it's like the most fucked up, twisted parts of ourselves that are like the most important and the most interesting. It's like actually the hard parts. That's where we find all like the most interesting stuff. I kind of like just try and follow my gut. Part of that was like going on this podcast with you guys. I don't even know how you like found me, or why you decided to write to me and invite me to come on your podcast. But I got the invite and I was just like, wait, do you want me to go on to your podcast and like talk about the ways that I was like fucked up and unaccountable when I was younger? Like,
Exactly
is
what we
that like, it's like, I guess I'll do it, but you know.
People so rarely will just like sit with themselves, like kind of like you said, and just like, okay, what's like the real me? Getting to know what you're about and what your sort of core values and beliefs are, because it's just so much of people's lives are just fed to them through a fucking screen of what they see on social media and what's given to them by an algorithm.
There are so many detriments to our current addiction to screens and phones and all of that because we're losing a lot of like our creative abilities because we are consistently sharing our attention span with something else. So time where you'd normally be standing in line at the grocery store, you're standing there, there's nothing to do. What do? You start thinking about things, or you think about, your to-do list or a conversation you had with someone, or you start humming a song to yourself. But instead now you just pick up your phone. So you're losing time, just little bits of time all throughout the day where you'd normally be introspective or creative or something a little bit more internal, literally just by picking up a phone and watching a short video on YouTube like I was doing, which is why I watched that. I knew all about this. Or, hopping on Facebook or Instagram or texting a friend or whatever. I think about that a lot ever since I watched that video, because I think about how many times I do pick up my phone when I don't really need to because there's nothing else going on. I've tried to carve out time where like when I go take my dog for a walk, I try not to have anything. I keep my phone, but it's on silent. It's in a bag that I carry around with me. I try not to listen to anything because that's a time where I get 30 plus minutes where I can just think about things. And I've noticed that that's when I can kind of, like, my brain spirals through different things that happened during the day or whatever. And I'm able to kind of give myself a little bit of feedback or contemplation or things that normally I don't really have the time for.
Yeah, man. That we're living through some wild technology. I think about it a lot in the context of madness, because I mean, it's actually, if you stop and think about it, just in the scope of history, the technology that we use hasn't been around for very long. And like, the radio, like, which was like in the earlier part of the last century, was like a new technology, and it totally changed people's lives. And I was totally raised. I'm like that generation that went straight from Sesame Street to MTV. That was my thing. And yeah, it fucked up my attention span. That fucked up my attention span, let alone like having a thing in your pocket. I think that there's going to inevitably have to be groups of people who set some fucking boundaries and do things differently.
All right, just to wrap it up, what role do you see for art or music, culture, any of that in building collective resilience against what we're dealing with in today's political state of fascism?
Oh, man.
A real easy one to
yeah, I gave you an easy one to end on.
Cap it off.
Oh, man. I mean, like, I think a lot about the relationship between the underground and the mainstream, and I feel like the mainstream, there's going to be underground resistance to fascism, but there's going to have to be like mainstream resistance to fascism too. And the thing that I feel just so deep in my heart when it comes to this stuff is that you can be a part of a social movement. You can be a part of something that's like, where there's a lot of people in it, but people really need to be able to like take care of each other in a movement. I'll give you a concrete example. So something in the Icarus Project that we started doing after we had been around for a couple of years was we started making these documents that we called mad maps, that were basically written documents that were like, this is what it looks like when I'm doing well. This is what it looks like when I'm struggling. These are the things I need to do to take care of myself. These are the people I need to be talking to about it. Like that at its most basic. And in recent years, I do a version of this that I call TMAPs, or Transformative Mutual Aid Practices. And it's an excuse to get together with other people and have conversations and write things down and basically leave yourself a trail. Because I think for a lot of people, especially we're having this whole conversation about like the ubiquity of social media and just like how people are so saturated in this culture. That shit comes on to us. It's like a wave, it's just like washes over us. Where was I? What have I been doing for the last hour? I don't even know, And I'm really interested in groups of people basically leaving themselves trails and thinking clearly about, in the context of mental health, it's like, what kind of languages am I using to talk about myself? Like how, and like, what are the things that are the most important to me? Let's just like use that as an example. Get together with a group of people and have a conversation about what's really important to me. What do I care about? Take 5 minutes, make a list, come back together in the group and talk about it. We could talk about all this negative stuff that's going on, but like human beings are actually like incredibly powerful. Like there's so much that we can do as people. There was this guy named Jacob Moreno. He's the guy who coined the term psychodrama. I don't know if you've ever heard that. He was back in the days like when the existentialist philosophers were talking about like how urban life was so alienating or whatever. This was this Romanian Jew who came to New York, and he was basically like, actually, all you need to do is get rooms full of people together and act out your issues. To do a psychodrama, it's like talk about like what's going on inside you and like act it out with people, having some kind of container to do it. And that's the kind of stuff that like is still incredibly powerful. In fact, even more powerful now because people are using social media so much and not used to talking to each other or whatever. But in the 1960s, there was this whole thing that they called the encounter movement, which was inspired by Jacob Moreno and his whole philosophies. It was basically groups of people that would get together and the boundaries were all fucked up because it was the 60s, but they'd have conversations where they'd talk about like, they'd encounter each other or whatever. I just think we need to be doing more stuff like that. And I think it's tricky because of the climate that we're in and people are so scared of each other. I get really inspired when I think about the 1960s and 70s, just because there were so many really interesting philosophies, like political philosophies and therapy models and like ways of thinking. All kinds of interesting stuff was happening. And then in the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan got elected president, the rise of the DSM and the rise of the biomedical model, that shit all got crushed. It got crushed. But it's all just like waiting for us to discover it again. So I guess my answer to your question is like, I think that there's actually a lot there waiting for us, and we need to build social movements where groups of people, we basically have excuses to try and be human again. And I'm not talking about trying to do it on some like big mass scale. I'm trying to talk about doing it on like small scales. So that's what keeps me going, is thinking along those kinds of lines.
Enough is a podcast centering on surviving abuse, harassment, and assault in the music scene. To help get the word out, please like and subscribe and share with your friends. In 2025, we are interested in talking to teachers, authors, artists, activists, counselors, community organizers, and anyone else who is dedicated to making a positive impact in their music community and our society as a whole. If that sounds like you, please reach out to us at thisisenoughpodcast@gmail.com.